Hey yo, welcome to Parker's Reef. On today's episode, we're going to get an update on some of the challenges I've been having in the Dream Reef tank. Alright, thank you for joining me on yet another episode of Parker's Reefs. And yes, we are here back standing right in front of the Dream Reef tank with the promised update on how I am going with some of the challenges I've been facing, which I think, to be fair, have probably been some of the only challenges I've faced with this build. I know I had the iodine spike early on, but I actually feel like I got out of that really scot-free with just a whole heap of water changes. But of late, I have been facing a few challenges that, to be honest, all reefers face. It's just taken me a good 3 or 4 years to get to this point in the Dream Reef tank, and I've just been documenting what I've been doing, or what I've been experiencing, what I've been doing, and what the results have been, and I'm here to share that with you today. So the first question may be, what problems exactly were we facing? Now, to start off, I had an explosion of bubble algae. Now, I have had bubble algae in this tank for the last few years, and it does normally just kind of hovers along. I don't have a huge outbreak of it. I see it in a few little spots. It slowly increases, but doesn't get drastically out of control. But a few months ago, it did get a little bit out of control and did start smothering the base of a few corals and causing a few upset pieces around there, and also just, not looking your best. It's difficult to sort of show off your pride and joy, particularly to people who are reefers. Non-reefers don't really care about bubble algae whatsoever, which is an important thing to take on board. But your experienced reefers that come over and have a look at the Dream Reef tank that they've seen online, they've seen the pictures, they've heard all about it, and they come see in person and they see bubble algae everywhere. It's kind of embarrassing. So when the bubble algae started to spread, I did consider it to be a pretty serious problem, and hand in hand with that was also a little bit of an aptasia explosion, which again is not something that I normally stress out over. I've always had a bit of aptasia in this tank, almost from the first piece I've put in the tank, and I never overreact to it. I have a little piece here and there. It might slowly increase, slowly get a bit bigger. In fact, I've got some in my sump that are absolutely massive. I reckon one of them is about the size of my fist, and I've got pretty big hands. But again, the aptasia, don't normally overreact to it, but it did start to get to plague proportions, and particularly when I removed my Australian stripey that was in here before, because I suspected he was up to a bit of mischief. I took him out of the tank, and the aptasia went from a few dozen to a few, I was going to say a few hundred, but probably more accurately a few thousand. The tank absolutely exploded with them, which was no doubt contributing to a few issues. Now that does lead on to the next problem I was experiencing, and that was some of my SBS pieces had started to STN. Now, STN, not RTN, same kind of result, I guess, just takes a little bit longer and maybe just takes the twist of the knife through the heart a little bit slower. But basically it means that the flesh off your acro or your SBS strips off and you're left with the bare white bone, and obviously the piece is dying. Now, RTN will typically do that overnight. You'll go from a bright, polyp extended, colourful SBS to a white piece with algae growing on it in 12 to 24 hours. STN takes maybe a few days or a few weeks. Now, I did have some random STN in this tank, which was very odd because other pieces absolutely thriving at the same time, but it was more than one off. I did start to get 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces sort of start to STN, which did sort of have me scratching my head and pulling my hair a little bit, which does lead on to the next problem I was experiencing at the same time, and to be fair, probably am still experiencing, and that is my beautiful hammer garden over here did start to recede a little bit and did drop a few heads, including a few entire pieces. Now, this is a real frustrating one, because this is, well, I was going to say front and center. It may be not front and center in the tank, but in the situation or location that this tank is in this room, this is the most prominent corner of the tank. You see it from all areas in this room, and when it is full and massive extension, the LPS has really got its elbows out and they're fighting over real estate, and they're bright and colorful and healthy. It looks incredible. When you've got hammers receding, you can see bare skeleton, a little bit of cyano growing on those dead pieces, or like this piece right here, an entire dead piece there. It doesn't look as good, and it's obviously an indication of something not going exactly right in the tank, of which I'm not entirely sure just yet, but we will go through my my methodology so far and where we're at very soon. Now, just to add to those already annoying issues, I did have a couple of fish losses in here. Nothing massive. I did find it was mostly the smaller fish that I had trouble with. I did unfortunately lose my beautiful female clownfish, which was the first fish in this Dream Reef tank. I had these beautiful coastal clownfish. I've still got my male. He loves living in the red goniopora there. I had a random loss of her. I did lose some various wrasse that I tried in this tank and some other smaller fish that just didn't work out for me. And I did long suspect the aggression of my chromis, and to be honest, could still be the problem. But when you get a handful of these challenges, and like I said earlier on in the video, every single reefer out there goes through these challenges. But when you start to stack a few of these challenges on top of each other all at once, things can spiral pretty quickly, because typically you lose a bit of interest in the tank, and when you lose interest in the tank, you get lazy with the tank, and that's when things can start to spiral. When you get lazy with the tank, things look worse, you get even less interested in the tank, they get even worse, and obviously you spiral down to the point where you want to pack up the tank and sell it because it's just taking your time, money, and energy, and that's not what you got into the hobby for. Now, thankfully, I could see this pattern happening and I did interject. I'm not about to give up on my Dream Reef tank because it is a dream reef to me. Now, whilst it has looked better before, it still looks incredible, and I will be able to get this back to its former glory. One thing to bear in mind, particularly with mixed reefs like this, things will go bad fairly quickly, and even when you address the problem, it takes much longer for things to go good again. They're a very fickle thing, these corals, and even our fish. They will get upset very quickly, very easily, but take a long pattern of perfect conditions with very minimal swings before they get back to their full supreme glory again. So it's a punishing hobby like that, where you can make one little slip up and things will go terrible, but you can do everything right and it will still take months and months before they look their best again. But it is important that we bear that in mind when we work through this sort of downward spiral that's going to try and kick you out of the hobby. Now, obviously, when you've got a number of issues going on, you need to sit down, take stock, and have a look at what is happening in the tank. And I'll go through what I've found with my system. Now, I've already talked about some of the issues and some of the potential causes there. I talked about both the bubble algae and the aptasia, that they were both already in the system, and we're just kind of hovering along at very barely noticeable amounts. And when the person who owns the tank says that there's only a small number in there, I assure you there's a very small number in there. When someone comes to look at the tank and they say there's a small number in there, the person whose tank it is will say there's hundreds or thousands in there. But I only had a few aptasia and a few bubble algae, and I wasn't worried about it. They weren't causing any issues. Obviously, bubble algae is one of those things, it does reproduce fairly quickly, and at some point in time it took off and caused some issues with some corals. But I do know the aptasia explosion was caused by removing the Australian stripey out of the system. He'd obviously been keeping those at bay. Within a week of taking him out of the system, they just exploded into a huge population, which was obviously not going to work very well at all. Now, to add to that, I did touch on that when the tank doesn't look its best, we tend to get a little bit lazy with it, and I absolutely had got a little bit lazy with my maintenance on this system, which did result in a little bit of a nutrient spike. Now, you may be wondering, what is a nutrient spike in the Dream Reef tank? Because I am one of those people that definitely do not run a ultra low nutrient system. But a nutrient spike for me in this system was phosphates up to 0.4 ppm, when I typically have them around 0.1 to 0.2, so I'd let them sort of double and get up a little bit higher. And likewise, nitrates that I normally keep around that 5 to 12 mark had got up to about the 25 mark. Now, it's not through a lack of water changes or anything like that. I have a fully automated water change system running non-stop in this system. So it wasn't like I just didn't get the energy into the tank and do the water changes that it needed or anything like that. But there was some things like some sump maintenance, where I just let a little bit of detritus settle into the sump and sort of clog the pores of the media in there, which is there to promote bacteria growth, which consumes or manages those nitrates and phosphates for you. But probably one of the biggest things I found with this tank was I had let the detritus in the actual display itself get up to a pretty proportional level. And I did find that when I went around initially with just my turkey baster to blow some of the detritus off those corals, and I saw just how much came off them, I quickly put the turkey baster down, grabbed a wave maker in my hand, one of my Nero 7s, and just went around the tank, literally blasting every coral in the system to get all the detritus off it. And let me tell you, I probably should have got it on camera, because the detritus cloud in this system was astronomical. There was so much detritus in there, and I must must admit, I always thought I was pretty good at blowing those corals off. I would get all the detritus off them maybe once a fortnight, once a month, but it must have been months because this tank got to the point where you could barely see through it. There was that much detritus in the water, and that was obviously contributing both to the nutrients but also to the lack of coral health in the system. Now, next up, and it is an item that I recommend to pretty much everyone who messages me and says, "Hey Sam, I'm having trouble with my tank, what do you recommend I do?" Just so you know, I follow my own advice. The first thing I wanted to do with this system, whenever you see any sort of problem, particularly with your coral health, send off an ICP test. It will tell you if any sort of parameters are out of check, including ones that you are testing for, because sometimes our home test kits can either be out of whack or get a bad batch or the reagent can go off. But more importantly, all of those elements we cannot test at home. Some of those trace elements, some of those heavy metals, things like that. Could be a pump breaking down. You're not adding those heavy metals, but all of a sudden your tin, your copper, your chromium has gone through the roof, your iron, and it's because the metal from an impeller of a pump is breaking down, and your corals definitely do not like a overdose of heavy metals. Interestingly, and I say interestingly because when I send off an ICP, I love to have one, maybe two things come back that are way out of whack, because then I know exactly what the problem is and generally exactly how to address that problem. Frustratingly, in this case, my ICP came back very, very good. Now, I will put the disclaimer there. I do typically use Triton for my ICP results because they do have a machine located here in Australia. Triton are currently doing some upgrades on their system and it is down. So I did go to my second ICP supplier or provider, and that was Reef Factory. So I was taking a little bit of a leap in faith in trying someone else's machine, not for a second suggesting that Reef Factory's ICP machine is not as good as Triton's or to suggest that Triton's is better than Reef Factory's or vice versa. Nothing like that. I do just find that if you trust one ICP machine, it's best to sort of try to stay with that ICP machine, even if the values are not 100% accurate, which people will tell me they are, and that's totally fine, not disagreeing with you, but at least you're gonna have a consistent reading. If it's always reading a little bit low, always reading a little bit high, you're gonna see the trend, and that's what I'm looking for in this system. Not overly concerned with the number as much, but I want to see if things like chromium are steadily going up or if they've bottomed out or something like that. So whilst it wasn't my most ideal scenario to get my Triton ICP, I did get a Reef Factory ICP done, and it did come back and tell me that everything was actually pretty good. If anything, my heavy metals had bottomed out a little bit, and I probably should increase my Reef Moonshiner's dosage. But before we go into the items that I actually actioned on the tank, let's just finish off with what I observed from the tank troubles that I was having. And observing is the key word there. Along with an ICP test of one of the things that I recommend to everyone out there that is having troubles with their tank, the second most important thing, if not maybe the first most important thing, is to observe your tank. I have spent many, many hours here, much more than I have previously, just sitting and watching. Now, it is a difficult watch because you're not just sitting there enjoying the tank, you're watching with a magnifying glass looking for things that are not quite right. And I'm talking about fish that are picking on other fish, fish showing mating behavior, fish that may be harassing corals, pests that might be harassing your corals, any other problem, maybe even flow dead spots, light dead spots, whatever it may be. Spend some time just having a good look at your system to make sure everything's running the way it should be, your fish are behaving the way they should be, and your corals are getting all of the things they need to thrive. Now, I did spend quite a bit of time here and I did discover a few things that I'd either assumed were not the issue or had assumed were the issue before, and we'll cover those now and what I've done to action these challenges that I faced with this tank. All right, so first and foremost, what you need to do when you are experiencing issues like this is go back to basics. Now, this tank is very, very far from the basics, and that's probably because of my nature. I like to complicate things with this system much more than they need to be. But when I am experiencing problems like this, I like to just go straight back to a known quantity and just get all of the basic things right. So we talked about how I went around and blew all the detritus off these corals. I then went through, cleaned all the sump, and I even cleaned out and replaced some of the media in my sump that was completely clogged with detritus. Now, thankfully, all of those changes have seen a very steady, slow but steady, which is probably ideal to be honest, decrease in my nutrients. Now, we talked about before that my nutrients were up to about 0.4 ppm phosphate and about 25, nearing 30 ppm nitrates, I've been able to get those back down into the realm of where I'm happy. My phosphate is coming down a little bit slower, but I'm deliberately doing that as slow as I can to get it down to about 0.10, 0.11 ppm, and I'm measuring that very frequently with my, thankfully, and thank you to Reef Factory for making it possible after I killed the last smart tester. They were able to provide me with some spare parts to get my smart tester back up and running, which has been fantastic. I can test my phosphate multiple times a day just to make sure that it is steadily declining, and if I do see a sharp increase at all, I can come and inspect the tank and see what's going on. But I've got that phosphate down to about 0.1 ppm, and my nitrates likewise have followed down, and they are now in the 7 to 8 ppm region, which is much better. Now I will say that hasn't actually really shown any difference in the corals just yet, but like I was saying before, I do think these things take some time. You've got to get the parameters into the window that you want, and then you've got to hold them steady in that window for quite a period of time before your corals really start to show their true self again. So I've got them in the window. I've been able to hold them there for a little while now. I just have to hold them there for much longer, and the corals will repay me in time. Now, sometimes you got to go one step forward, two steps back, and in this case, I think this was one step forward, two steps back. To treat the bubble algae that had exploded in this tank, I did jump on the Continuum program, which I've talked about on this channel before. There is a trio of products you can dose in morning, afternoon, and night, and I've got to say, I've never had any problems with them before, but this time when I did do it, whilst it absolutely took care of the bubble algae, and I don't think I can see any bubble algae anywhere in this system, which is fantastic. This time around, it did take a little bit of a knock on my corals, and I think that could explain where I'd lost that little bit of color from the corals. Now, I touched on before that I've never experienced this problem before, but when I've ran that bubble algae treatment from Continuum before, my tank was in a much better place. So this time when my corals were already struggling a little bit and I go and give it a 1-2 punch with an algae treatment program, I think that does explain a little bit of the color loss and maybe even some of the receding heads on my hammers, maybe some of the RTN or STN that I had on some of the SPS pieces, maybe not, but I do think when they were struggling a little bit and they copped that extra hard time, it absolutely did give them a bit more of a hit than it did previous times when I've done that treatment. But it did achieve its purpose. I did want to get the bubble algae out of there, restart that, and I am happy to say that it completely took care of that problem. Now I can work on getting the coral color and health back to where it was without worrying about the bubble algae. Now, likewise, the Aptasia, which pretty much went hand in hand with the bubble algae, I treat them almost the same in that I don't stress when I see bubble algae or Aptasia till they get to the point where they're smothering corals and then it's a problem. So I gave the algae the treatment with the Continuum equation program, and I gave the Aptasia a treatment by adding a trio of baby Australian stripies. They've done an incredible job. I put them in. These were the smallest guys I could get, and they've probably doubled in size since I added them in. I put these 3 guys in, and I would say within a week, I went from being able to count at least 1,000 Aptasia in this system to really struggling to find any. I'm not going to say there's none in the tank because there absolutely is. Despite getting the smallest Australian stripies I could, I did have a couple in places where they just cannot get to, and I do have a solution for that. I did also pick up one of these Reef Deletes, which I know there's varied opinions on out there, and I will say that I'm not 100% certain that this would address your Aptasia problem on its own, but I can say the addition of using this UVC torch in combination with adding the Australian stripies decimated my Aptasia in record time. I just used this big boy here to melt a couple of the big ones in difficult spots to get to, and for whatever reason that sent these guys' appetite into overdrive, and they then cleaned up every single Aptasia after that for me. So whilst there's only a couple hidden deep, particularly in things like the blue digi here, there's a couple right in the base of that which no one's going to get to be fair, but the stripies are not touching any corals, and they have absolutely touched every single Aptasia they can get their little mouths on, so I'm going to call that a success. Now, the next thing I did in this tank was probably a little bit off script. However, I would rather be safe than sorry. And whilst my ICP results were showing that my heavy metals were, if anything, a little bit low, I wanted to be 100% certain that there were no heavy metals in here leaching out of any sort of pumps or equipment that were causing all of the problems I was seeing in the system. So I did run a course of Metasol UHC, which is a heavy metal absorber. Normally, this is the sort of thing you would run if you get an ICP result back that has one of of your heavy metals through the roof. You can either spend the next 6 years of your life doing water changes to try and get it out, or you can run something that's going to absorb that heavy metal, get it out of your water column, obviously find the source that's adding it to it, but then you've got to get it out of the water column. And this product does that job fantastically. Now, like I said, I did get an ICP result back and it showed me that my heavy metals were low, but some of the problems I was seeing in here really did look like a heavy metal contamination. So I ran the Metasol UHC for 1 week, which it does recommend you run for sort of 7 to 11 days, I think it is. I ran it for 1 week just to strip any excess heavy metals out of the system, just so I knew that I was starting from a level playing field. I can always add through my trace element program heavy metals back in, but it's much more difficult to get them out. So I thought, even if they are low, I'll add the Metasol. It will pull nothing out of the tank, or if there is something that the ICP didn't pick up, it'll pull that out of the tank. We can start from square one and go back from there. Like I touched on before, sometimes it's important to go back to basics, and this, whilst I'm not going to say Metasol is a basic solution, but the concept of stripping any rogue heavy metal trace elements out of the system, get them out of there, start from scratch, and then slowly build them back up again seemed like a good idea to me. I will say though that after running this for a week, I didn't notice any of the colors on the back. There was no sort of contamination on the Metasol. So I am going to assume that the Reef factory ICP was spot on and there were no heavy metals in the system. Still, peace of mind, I ran the Metasol, stripped them all out, and then I could go about adding those elements back in. Now, speaking of adding those elements back in, and this will be a little bit of a contentious one, a lot of you out there know I do run Reef Moonshiners, which is probably, to be fair, a little bit more of an advanced trace element supplementation program. Now, whilst there is no shortage of help through the fantastic community online, the calculators, the handbook, no shortage of information to make sure that you don't get that wrong. Once again, I just wanted to go back to basics. So after stripping out any excess heavy metals from the system, I went back to a very simple trace element program, just temporarily until I get Triton ICP results back in, where I can do a quick turnover of my water sample to see where my trace elements are at. Then I'll be comfortable going back into my daily supplementation of Reef Moonshiners. But in that short term, I have gone back to a Coral Essentials ABC. Now, whether it's Coral Essentials, whether it's Aquaforest, whether it's something else, I've gone back to a very basic mixed trace element supplementation. Now, I have also gone back to a half dosage. Coral Essentials recommend 1 drop per 100 liters of each of these A, B, and C droppers into your tank. I've gone back to half that, and I'm only putting 7 drops per day into this tank of each one of those bottles. Again, just to slowly build them up. As soon as Triton is back on board and I can get sort of my ICP results back within a week, and I can really pump through a few there, really get my baseline right back, build my Reef Moonshiners back up and get everything back into the window where I'm happy, then I will transition back to my Reef Moonshiners and really start fine tuning all those trace elements to get the supplementation each day exactly where I want them. But for now, let's go back to basics and just get the simple things right. Now, one last thing that I did do to this tank as a supplementation at least was to add a little bit of organics back into the system. I did suspect, as I touched on earlier, that running that Continuum equation program when the tank was not at its absolute best did give it a pretty hard hit to the guts. Now, I must admit, I don't confess to know what is in the Continuum program, but I'm suspecting that it does sort of strip organics a little bit to kill off things like bubble algae out of your system. So since then, I've been trying to add some organics back into the system just to try and help get that nice, happy, diverse biological ecosystem that lives in this glass box. Now, the best way I could do that was to add a little bit of extra new, fresh live rock into the sump. And also I have been adding, like I have for quite some time, but I have increased the frequency of the dosage of the Aquaforest Life Source, which is that awesome mud that you mix up with a bit of tank water. Pour it in the tank, your tank goes horribly cloudy for a couple of hours, or if you're like me, you do it at night time. You come out the next morning, the water is crystal clear and everything looks incredible. Now, I must confess, I normally do Life Source maybe once a month on this tank. For the last month or two, I've been doing it every week to week and a half, just to try and get those missing organics, all of those little bacterial items, any of that little bit of the ecosystem that I was missing before, in conjunction with the addition of the live rock into the system, just to try and re-establish potentially what that Continuum program took out. Now, I know this is the section where we talk about the things that I've done in the tank, but I'm going to talk about what I haven't done in the tank just yet, based on the observation I took where sitting right in front of this tank for a good few hours to have a look at how things were working. And that is that whilst I may have been quick to blame, at least for some of the RTN or STN on my acroporas, these guys here, my blue-green chromas, who are definitely, they've been with me for quite some time now. I've had them for 10 to 11 years for the most of them. They're definitely at a mature stage, and they do get quite aggressive each night, and they do show a lot of breeding behaviors which have been known to strip the base of acroporas so that they can lay their eggs on there. Now, I'm not going to 100% say that they're not doing that, but by observing my tank, I can 100% say that my very cheeky and beloved hybrid angel Prius, who's probably hanging out over there right now, has been having a little bit of fun with these hammers. Now, what I'm not 100% certain on is if he is the cause, or if he just post the cause when the hammers are struggling, he comes and sort of cleans them up a little bit. But I can say that I have hammers that are full, open, loving life one day, and then the next day he's hovering around one, giving it a little haircut here and there, and it will shrink and reduce and look like it's on its last leg. I've got a perfect example of one of those today. That hammer there on screen right now was full of life yesterday. Today it looks like it is dying, and Prius will hang around that, making sure that it just stays on that dying side of things until I can distract him with something else. So whilst I haven't done anything about Prius just yet, I am contemplating my next steps with him, and it's a super difficult one because he is absolutely my favorite fish, and to be fair, he's that close to being irreplaceable. These hybrid angels are so rare and uber expensive these days that it's not the sort of fish that I'm just going to rehome or put in another tank or move him to the sump. He's kind of like when you've got a child and the child's misbehaving. You don't just drop them off in the middle of the woods and say, have a nice life. You've got to try and coach them through that. Now, the challenges are, I'm a human, Prius is a fish. I'm not 100% certain how I coach a fish through to not eat my corals anymore. I am asking you, the audience out there, what would you do to try and distract Prius? The things I have done is add some stick-on tabs, the beautiful the stick-on tabs from Sarah that I've stuck on the tank, and he does come and show some interest in them, but I must admit, I don't actually see him eating them directly. He just kind of comes around and hovers around the other fish that are doing all of the activity. I've contemplated adding some more fish into the system. He is a little bit aggressive. He doesn't actually do any harm to the fish, but he does like to sort of chase them for at least 20 or 30 centimeters until he gets puffed because he's pretty overweight. Not that I can talk at all, but I'm wondering if I add some new fish that will keep him distracted, he might sort of chase them around rather than eating my corals, because he just sits over in this hammer garden just thinking that it's a sizzler buffet or something. I'm not actually sure what else to do. I could potentially remove him, put him in an isolation box for a little while, like a timeout. I could put him in another tank temporarily and then reintroduce him, although I would be hesitant if I put him back into the tank. He could see some sort of aggression from the tangs or something, and if I lost Prius, I would be pretty heartbroken. He is a absolute showpiece fish for me, but yeah, that's one thing I did observe during that observation of the tank, and I'm not 100% certain what to do. And like I said, he could be causing more issues than I was initially willing to admit that he was. All right, so the obvious question is, how are things going now? After all of that observation, identifying, and then putting plans in place, doing some of those plans, how is the tank doing now? And to be fair, I'd say it's probably at about 65–70%. It's definitely far from its best, but I believe things are on the right path. And I say that because whilst I still sort of see my hammer garden over here, and it kind of breaks my heart a little bit, and I see a couple of SBS that aren't looking great, I am super happy to say that some other corals have absolutely exploded in the system, sometimes to their own detriment at that. Things like my red Monty Cap over here that was always a massive coral has exploded in size, probably doubled in size, to the point where it's actually shading itself and may even kill off some of the lower levels or caps of that piece, which I will need to remove at some point in time, which won't be a bad thing because I don't just want a tank of red Monty Cap, and it's slowly becoming that. Things like my Dustin's cousins actually shot some huge pieces up reaching for the surface. It's got great color, great polyp extension, looking an absolute beast. Some other Monty that I've got in this system here that I got from Nick at Nick's Aquarium up in Brisbane. I've got some down the front here which is absolutely engulfing this Fireworks Acro and also a Trachophilia there. It's just smothering them, it's growing so quickly. And I've got another piece of the same Monty up the back, which I just sort of put in a dark section of the tank, and it is completely fanned out and has beautiful color and contrast and is growing so quickly, it's ridiculous. Over this way, things like my Goniopora are looking fantastic despite the clownfish deciding that's his home and absolutely punishing that coral all day long. My gold bower, let's say gold bowerbanki, but my orange or rusty bowerbanki, I like to call it gold, I quite like the color of it, down here is really settled in and is doing a fantastic job. My Space Invader Pectinia here is doing really, really good. It's a real litmus test of a coral, that one. Sometimes it will really shrink in and the flesh will be stretched over the skeleton. It looks so, so sad. I put it back into the shade a little bit and it's puffed right up. It's actually almost like a T-ball or a softball now. It's bright yellow and round and is shooting out new branches. Things like my green stag over here, obviously the blue digi, I could probably put that in the toilet and it would grow, and it is still growing despite me removing things. My red dragon's doing fantastic. My high-end Monty caps, the Sunfire grafted cap, and also my red and purple infused cap, just growing an absolute treat. Some other pieces, yes, are struggling, and I can see a little bit of patches of die-off and things there, but to be fair, that's reefing. Sometimes things thrive and go well, sometimes they don't, and I probably stacked this tank with too many corals early on and didn't give them a lot of space, particularly knowing that I was going to grow some of these out into massive colonies. So you get to the point where this section here, I've got like 4 or 5 corals just completely fused into each other, and surprisingly, they're doing really well. This Monty here literally has bits of Dustin's Cousin and Red Dragon growing through it, and all 3 or all 4 of those pieces are still quite happy. So you cannot ask for much more than that. And I think it's a super important thing to focus on, is what is doing well in the tank rather than focus on what is not doing well in the tank, because it is a living system. Things are going to go well, things are going to go bad. My good friend Dave always tells me that reefing is a roller coaster. There are highs, there are lows. You have to celebrate the highs and you have to tolerate the lows, otherwise you're going to have a really, really bad time. But to keep things tangible and talk about how things are doing, apart from just the visuals or my opinion of how it's doing, I talked about before how my nutrients are definitely back under control and are in the window where I want to hold them there for a good few months to get these corals looking their absolute best. I am fairly confident now that the detritus has been blown off, whilst I am doing it much more frequently. I'm taking a page out of Jules's book where he has that, what I labeled as Australia's best nano, and copped a little bit of flack because people tell me that a 2-foot cube is not a nano. Regardless of what you call a nano or not, that tank is ridiculously nice and has corals jam-packed in there together, and Julian blows the detritus out of those every single week. So I took a page out of his book and I've been doing the same thing with this system, and it has done wonders for both the corals but also the nutrients and getting them all out of the system and back where I want them. All right, so what is next now that I've identified what I believe is the problem, though I never found a smoking gun? I've observed the tank to try and solidify my thoughts as to what the problem was. I've done some actions to try and get this back under control. What is next now that I've got a bit of a plan to get this system back and thriving? Now, we talked about the nutrients are where I want them, so I've just got to hold them there. I will get my ICP program back under control and get my trace elements back exactly into the Reef Moonshiner window where I want them, where this tank was at its absolute best. I will need to run a cyano treatment in this system because I believe through that Continuum program, and it is a fairly well-known side effect, that you can get little patches of cyano following that, and I have definitely over in some lower flow sections on my sand and even on some of my rock, and definitely any corals that die off, the cyano just appears instantly on them straight after that. I do have a few patches of cyano here and there that I do just want to clean up. Now, I don't want to overreact to a little bit of cyano on there. I don't want to run like a red slime treatment program, which is basically a liquefied silver, which kills off all the sort of bacteria in your system. I'm not quite at that stage. I will try and run some additional bacteria in the system to try and build the stability back up there and see if I can clean them out that way. I do find that it's much more gentle on the whole ecosystem, but definitely on your coral health. And like I touched on before, when I did the bubble algae treatment, when my corals weren't at their full strength, they took a pretty solid hit. So I don't want to repeat that with a cyano treatment. I want to try and go the gentle approach and run some Continuum Gen M, maybe some Dr. Tim's. I'll see what other sort of solutions are out there that can help the cyano without being really harsh on the corals. So that's definitely something I'll approach. I will have to get some new tongs and remove the dead skeletons from this tank, because as much as I wanted to keep them in there just so I could stay grounded and stay where I was at with the tank to see what had been working, what hadn't, what's been thriving, what's slowly receding, and what's completely dead, it is time to move forward now, and I do need to remove memories of things that were better. So dead skeletons have to be removed from the tank. Where things like my SPS have died off, I'll put some new pieces on there, or maybe I'll just clear it back. So some of these big colonies have got a little bit of extra room to grow out. But basically, I want to get rid of anything that doesn't look its best in there. I think I'll need to pull the gold hammer out and maybe trim it back, just because having this massive dead sort of skeleton with a little bit of flesh hanging off, it doesn't look great, and it will probably also help the gold hammer in recovering and giving it its best chance of surviving through whatever struggles it has gone through. Now, next up is the one that I talked about before, and that is what I have to do to distract Prius. I am thinking the best way to do that will be to distract him with some new fish. I am completely open to your suggestions out there. I am going to try feeding maybe up this end of the tank. I typically just feed in this corner here, and I wonder whether the food just coming down here just makes it easy for a lazy fat fish like that to sit there and just eat the food when it's there, and then eat the corals when the food's not there. So I'm going to try and tempt him up to this end of the tank where there's not as much hammer action there for him to just nibble on. But I am contemplating the addition of some anthias, some more new fish, maybe some other small fish that he can sort of bully a little bit without actually hurting them, just to keep him busy and keep him occupied and move him on from the fact that eating coral is fun. Because I've had Prius for a long time now, and he hasn't ever really been an LPS eater. He would definitely like to keep the polyps of my SPS trims, but that never really hurt the SPS. But I am suspecting that he could be nibbling away at this LPS hammer garden here, so I do have to distract him one way or the other. Now, one other thing that I do need to do on this system is to have a look at the flow, because I talked about the detritus that was settling on some of these corals, and whilst it's great that I'm now going around with a turkey baster and a pump every single week and making sure that's flushed out, obviously it's going to be more sustainable and better long term if I can have the flow take care of that for me. I have gone and cleaned every single one of my flow pumps in the tank, and I've got them, as you can probably see here, turned up pretty high at the moment. She's a fair washing machine in there, but I do still have some dead spots through the center of the tank here, and particularly where these large colonies have sort of grown out and have become really big walls blocking the flow and also the light, which we'll touch on in a second. So I do need to investigate what I'm going to do to add some more flow into some of these dead spots, and I'm contemplating adding some Nero 7s on the back wall just in around this center section here, which is a little bit more difficult to get to because just the physical location of the tank there. I'll have to reach right over to get the magnets in, but I think we can make that work with the Nero 7s just to keep the water flowing through here, make sure the detritus is not settling on the corals, it's getting in the water column, up and down into my sump to be removed by the filter roller and also the skimmer. I did briefly touch on lighting in there, and I know we've talked about my lack of interest in the Orfec OR3 light bars in this tank, and I had one die on me. I have been promising a video where I'll compare some different light bars. That's taken a little bit longer than expected, to be honest, but I've had that one die, and then since then I've had another one die. So I do absolutely have to pull my thumb out and get that video together to compare these lights and see what I'm going to replace those Orfecs with. I am still looking to compare against some AI blades, some of the Reef factory lights, maybe some some Illumagic Vitaminis, some different light options out there, and a nice slim light bar to give that supplemental blue pop, which, to be fair, the Philips Coral Care is not an overly blue light, so I do want to add some extra blue supplementation. And I can say that with this one and that one out, I have noticed, particularly in those later stages in the day when the Coral Cares start to dim down, that the tank's not evenly lit, and it's driving me nuts. So I do have to address both the light and the flow in this tank, particularly as these big colonies grow out. All right, now the last thing I need to do with this reef tank to get it back to its former glory, and that is to enjoy what is working well with it. I briefly touched on before that we definitely get caught up on what's not going perfect in our reef tanks. And to be honest, that's almost everything that is wrong with this hobby. It is a living ecosystem. If you go out into the wild and you see reefs out there, I assure you there will be sections that die off, that then respawn, things will break down, it'll let fresh flow through. It is what happens on reefs, and unfortunately it's even further dramatized in a closed box like this. No matter how big your reef tank is at home, you are dealing with a closed ecosystem, things that are dynamically changing right before your eyes, and there will be ups and there will be downs. It's super easy to get hyper focused on the downs, but the reality is they're always going to be there. So I am going to enjoy what is going well with this reef tank, and I've got to tell you, there is heaps going well with it, and I am really honestly looking forward to the challenge to get this back as close as I can to its former glory, if not surpass it. And if that's not the challenge of this reefing hobby, I do not know what is. All right, now that we have talked about what has been going on with the Dream Reef Tank, I'll give you a quick update on what is to come on this YouTube channel. I've taken advice from you guys out there, my wonderful viewers, and you guys have said you want to see more tank tours, more product reviews. Well, I'm happy to say we're going to tick both of those boxes. I've got some tank tours coming up from tanks at various stages and various different approaches, from a nano system that has fairly low technology to it that looks incredible, through to a revisit of a system we saw a couple of years ago that is now absolutely thriving and does have almost every gadget under the sun on it. So we're going to check out those two bookend systems, and we're also going to check out a huge range of brand new products. I'll give you full product reviews on a number of really cool things, including some continuous duty dosing pumps from Reef Factory, the brand new Quijan, I think that's how you pronounce it, the intelligent sensor from Kamoa, which gives you an active measurement of your pH, your AUP, your salinity, your conductivity, your temperature, all sorts of incredible things there. And I've also been fortunate enough to get my hands on an Alkatronic Professional, the brand new device from the guys at Focustronic. This is not their Mastertronic Essential, but this is the updated version of their Alkatronic tester. I've personally never had my hands on one of their alkalinity testers before, so I'm super curious to see how that compares against the KH Guardian. And I have also had some updated pieces to test out the Kamoa Reef Master Spa, including some brand new reagents which will hopefully address those troubles I was having with the nitrate readings. And also they've taken on board my advice and come up with a beautiful acrylic holder so that you can put all of your reagents in a box and keep it neat and tidy. So stay tuned for all of those updates coming right here on this channel over the next few weeks. Other than that, guys, I will wrap things up there. I will just give you a quick heads up that if you have not yet seen it, this tank, albeit not through the troubles it's going through right now, but a couple of months ago was featured on the Reef Hobbyist Magazine. It is a physical print magazine in the United States, but do not fear, if you're not from the United States, the guys at Reef Hobbyist Magazine do make a digital version available to read free online. And I'll be sure to put the link to that down here. You can check out my article that I wrote about this tank, about the process of designing it, implementing it, stocking it, and enjoying it. So you can read all about that there if you have not yet heard enough about this Dream Reef tank anyway. But the guys did a fantastic job on that article, and some really nice pictures and videos on that article as well. So be sure to follow the link and check that out at Reef Hobbyist Magazine. Now, one more little heads up I do want to give is for the Dalua YouTube channel. The guys over there have been working incredibly hard over the last number of months to produce a brand new reefing series called the 12-Week Reef. Now, this is like nothing you've seen on the reefing YouTube scene before. It is absolutely chock-a-block full of not just informative content, but a heap of comedy, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved in that series a number of times, and I really look forward to seeing those videos come out weekly over the next few months. Be sure to head over their channel, subscribe, and keep an eye out for it, because whilst it is aimed at how we get new people into this hobby, you will absolutely pick up a tip or two, even if you're an old salty reefer like I am. It was a fantastic series, and I really do look forward to seeing how well it's received in the industry. So by all means, head on over to the Dalua channel, hit a subscribe button over there, and keep an eye out for the 12-Week Reef. Other than that, guys, I will leave you with it. I do want to give a massive shout out to my channel subscribers. We're edging closer to that 30,000 mark. And these guys up on screen here now, these are all of my fantastic channel members who do chip in a couple of bucks each month to make these videos possible. I really humbly appreciate it, and I really look forward to bringing you guys the content you want to see throughout the rest of this year and beyond. Other than that, guys, I should wrap things up. I really do appreciate you taking the time to see how things are going with my dream reef tank. If you are going through some similar challenges, fear not, we'll get through them together. Other than that, guys, I look forward to seeing you next week with Blake's incredible nano cube. Till then, stay safe, keep reefing. Cheers, bye.